In Chapter 1, we followed the human story from its earliest beginnings through millions of years of evolution, adaptation, and survival. But having a body like ours did not automatically mean thinking like us. At some point, our ancestors began to see more than the world directly in front of them. They planned for futures that had not even happened yet. They created symbols, exchanged ideas, decorated themselves, and carried knowledge across generations. And eventually, some of them looked beyond Africa. Not every journey would succeed. Some populations disappeared. Others met humans who had already been living beyond the continent for hundreds of thousands of years. But one migration would change the history of the entire planet. This is the story of the modern mind and the exits from Africa. Okay, we ended the last part of the story carefully, not with a body finished, but with a recognizably modern human form that was existing across Africa, alongside real anatomical variation that persisted for a long time, even as that broader pattern took hold. This part of the story picks up from there. If you assume that form immediately started doing something recognizable, arts, language, ritual, all the things that make a human beyond just their skeleton, you assumed something reasonable. The truth is stranger than either the mind arrived right away or the mind arrived late. It's actually messier than both. Here's what the evidence actually shows. Capacities that feel recognizably human don't appear in the archaeological record as one clean event. They appear unevenly, in different combinations, in different places, at different times. Sometimes they vanish from the record and reappear millennia later, sometimes somewhere else entirely. And because behavior preserves far less reliably than bone, what survives in the record is only ever a fraction of what these populations were actually capable of. Absence of evidence, once again, is not the same as evidence of absence. This isn't a hedge, it's the actual current state of the field. By roughly 320,000 years ago, at a site called Olorgesailie in Kenya, the record already shows smaller, more carefully prepared tools, pigments worked and used, and obsidian carried across distances that imply organized long-range exchange or travel. At Herto in Ethiopia, human skulls roughly 160,000 years old show modifications the excavators interpreted as deliberate mortuary treatment, i.e. taking care of the dead. None of this is confidently art in the way a painted cave wall is art, but none of it is nothing either. Long before the sites this video is about to spend real time with, something recognizably deliberate was already happening. So before we go looking for the clearest examples of symbolic behavior, we need to ask a question that sounds simple and turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer. What would we even be looking for? Researchers call this behavioral modernity, and it's worth being honest about what an odd, slippery category it actually is. It's not one trait, it's a cluster. Symbolic thought, the capacity to let one thing stand for another. Abstraction, planning that reaches beyond the next meal. Language sophisticated enough to carry ideas that aren't right in front of you. Art, ritual, trade with strangers, which requires trusting people you've never met. Any one of these is hard to prove from a scattering of old bones and broken stone. And researchers have repeatedly failed to find one clean, universal modernity package. One discrete threshold that, once crossed, means a population had officially arrived. The search for that single threshold has increasingly given way to something messier, a mosaic. Let's make that mosaic concrete rather than abstract. Symbolic behavior doesn't show up gradually and evenly across the whole continent starting at one date. It shows up early in some places, later in others, richly in one period, and then goes quiet for a stretch before resurfacing somewhere else. That unevenness isn't a gap in the story. It may simply be what the story really looked like. So here's the honest framing this video is going to hold on to, because it fits the evidence better than either of these two easy stories. The modern mind did not awaken once in one place at one moment. Capacities that feel recognizably human appear unevenly, in different combinations across the continent over an enormous stretch of time. Sometimes they persist. Sometimes they vanish. What the record shows us is expression, not the full limits of what the minds that produced it. So we're about to visit one of the richest, best documented traditions of that expression. A cave in South Africa overlooking the sea, where people were deliberately, carefully making marks that meant something. Tens of thousands of years before the cave paintings most people picture when they hear the words, the first art. Not the first, but one of the earliest we can confidently document. That distinction matters, and we're going to hold on to it carefully from here forward. If you grew up with any image at all of the first human art, there's a good chance it looks like this. A torch-lit cave somewhere in France or Spain, painted in ochre and charcoal with a herd of horses or bison, rendered with a skill that still stops people in their tracks today. Lascaux, Chauvet. Here's the problem with that image. It is tens of thousands of years too late, and it hides how much earlier the archaeological record begins elsewhere, especially in Africa. Let's go to South Africa instead, to a cave called Blombos, on a stretch of coastline overlooking the Indian Ocean. Look at something far less spectacular than a painted bison, a small piece of ochre, a soft reddish stone with a pattern of cross-hatched lines deliberately scratched into its surface. Not a random scrape, a repeated, structured geometric pattern carved on purpose, dating to somewhere between roughly 100,000 and 75,000 years ago, with a separate abstract drawing at the same site, dated to about 73,000 years ago. We want to be precise about what Blombos actually represents, because the honest version is more interesting than the oversold one. It isn't the first mark that ever meant something. That title probably can't confidently be assigned to anywhere on Earth. There's a deliberate geometric engraving associated with Homo erectus at Trinil in Java, hundreds of thousands of years older, though we genuinely don't know whether it carried symbolic meaning or something close to it. What Blombos actually is, and what makes it remarkable regardless, is one of the earliest sustained, convincing traditions of abstract mark making we can confidently associate with our own species. Not a lucky scratch, but a repeated practice, returned to it again and again. And it's not the only evidence at the site. Alongside the engraved ochre, the same layers have produced small shell beads, deliberately pierced through, almost certainly for stringing and wearing. Someone worked a hole through a shell with real effort and wore it, which strongly suggests display, identity, or social affiliation. We can't tell you exactly what wearing it communicated or to whom. That specific meaning is gone. But the deliberate, repeated effort to make and wear it does survive. Worth noting, though, honestly, is Blombos isn't even the oldest bead evidence we have. Shell beads from Bismoon Cave in Morocco have been dated to at least 142,000 years ago, older than the Blombos beads by a wide margin. We're not telling you this to undercut Blombos. We're telling you because getting the first claim right, or admitting when it can't be pinned down at all, is more important than protecting a clean narrative. Beyond Blombos and Bismuth, the pattern widens. At pinnacle point, early and sophisticated use of pigment sits alongside evidence of resourceful, well-planned use of coastal food sources. At deep kloof, fragments of ostrich eggshell used as containers carry engraved geometric patterns. A different material, a different technique. The same underlying signature of deliberate, repeated, meaningful mark making. Multiple sites, multiple materials, multiple regions. That spread matters because a single decorated object at a single cave could be dismissed as an outlier. Several independent examples doing similar things in similar ways at different places is something closer to a genuine pattern, evidence of a widespread capacity, not one unusually gifted individual. It took the scientific community a long time to recognize objects like these for what they actually are. And it's worth naming honestly why. An unspoken assumption that real symbolic culture had to look like a painted animal or something on the cave wall, something immediately recognizable to a modern eye. A scratched geometric pattern just did not fit that picture. And for longer than it should have, it was just not given equal weight. And one more piece of restraint, because overclaiming here would just undercut everything that we just built. We can say with real confidence that the people who made these marks were capable of symbolic thoughts. We cannot tell you what any specific pattern is meant to the person that made it. That meaning, unfortunately, is gone. What we can say, plainly, somewhere in the long, uneven mosaic the last section described, in a cave over the ocean in South Africa, people were repeatedly, deliberately making marks that for them, it meant something. Among the earliest sustained traditions of that behavior, we can currently document anywhere else on the planet. Next, though, we leave symbol and meaning behind, at least for a while, and turn to a different kind of evidence entirely. Not what these populations were expressing, but what they were building. The last section was about symbol. This one is about method, a genuinely different kind of evidence, and it deserves to be told on its own terms rather than just blurred into one vague story about the mind taking off. Let's start with a real engineering problem and how someone, somewhere, solved it. A single stone flake is a good cutting edge, but it's not a spear. And there's only so much force you can apply gripping a loose blade in your fist. At some point in this period, people worked out how to join a stone point to a wooden shaft. Using a binding, likely plant fiber, a sinew, and an adhesive, probably a resin prepared specifically for this job. The result was a composite tool. Multiple materials, multiple steps planned in advance and then combined toward a single finished object. It's worth being precise about what makes this all significant, because it isn't that earlier tools were simple by comparison. They weren't. Producing a well-made Acheulean hand axe or the carefully prepared stone cores, this same period sometimes used, already demanded real planning, real skill, and a mental model of the finished shape that was held in the mind before a single strike was made. What composite technology adds isn't planning itself. It's coordination across entirely different materials. Each gathered, each prepared through its own separate process, brought together toward one object none of the individual pieces could have achieved alone. One thing that this toolkit made possible was more sophisticated hafted weaponry. Stone points fixed securely to wooden shafts. Some may have belonged to a handheld thrusting spear, others to weapons thrown or propelled from a distance, and archaeology often cannot determine the exact delivery system from the stone point alone. What is clear, though, is that hafting changed the reach, the force, the repairability, and design possibilities of the weapon in question. And here's the detail that sounds almost too clever to even be real. Heat-treated stone. Certain stone types flake more predictably and more sharply if deliberately heated before being worked. Someone figured that out, not by accident. And since the evidence points to a consistent, repeated practice, a genuine piece of applied materials science worked out through trial and through observation long before anyone even had a word for chemistry. All right. Now part of the story, or part of the section that complicates this tidy story that you were expecting. If hafted weaponry, and heat-treated stone sound like steady, accumulating progress, unfortunately, the record has a stranger twist just waiting around the corner. Researchers have identified regional toolmaking traditions in this period. One known as Steel Bay, another known as Howie Sun's Port, each showing real sophistication for a defined stretch of time. And then, in both cases, their distinctive archaeological signatures disappear from the record, or reorganize into something else, for a considerable stretch before anything comparable would ever show up again. We should be careful, though, with the word vanish. The precise chronology, regional spread, and relationship of these traditions to what surrounds them is still genuinely debated, and total disappearance overnight oversells what the evidence actually shows. What the evidence does support is a pattern of episodic, discontinuous technological development. Sophistication that doesn't always stick, doesn't always transmit cleanly across generations, doesn't behave like a one-way ratchet. That cuts against an assumption that most people carry without realizing it, that technological progress, once achieved, simply accumulates. It doesn't always. Innovation in this period looks more like a bush. Remember last video? If you haven't, go check that out. Branches of technique growing outward, some of them stopping or reorganizing, without that necessarily meaning anything went wrong. It doesn't always mean it's linear, is the TLDR here. Compare this directly to what came before. The earliest known stone traditions were comparatively simple. The Acheulean tradition that followed remained recognizable for more than 1 million years, even as its tools varied across regions and generations. This period is defined by neither of those patterns. Real complexity and real discontinuity at the same time. So, while some patterns in this stretch were scratching meaning into stone, others sometimes, very possibly the same people, were working out how to bind a point to a shaft, how to construct more effective hafted weapons, how to heat a rock to shape it more precisely. And more than once, a specific tradition of that cleverness does go quiet in the record, for reasons we just can't explain just yet. So now, we're going to turn to a completely different kind of evidence. Again, not objects at all, but the genetic record, and a tool that now lets researchers read history directly out of a living person's DNA. Everything so far in this video has come from objects. A scratched piece of ochre, a pierced shell, a stone point bound to a wooden shaft. Objects are wonderful evidence, but they have an obvious limitation. Someone has to make them, lose them in the exact right spot, and that spot has to survive undisturbed for tens of thousands of years until someone digs in exactly the right place. A great deal of history simply never leaves that kind of evidence behind, which is why the tool that this section introduces is such a genuine breakthrough It requires a living person alive right now and a sample of their DNA, because written into every one of us is a record of where our ancestors come from and who are they mixed with. Researchers reconstruct this by comparing genetic differences among living populations and where it can be recovered. Ancient DNA preserved in old remains, using known patterns of genetic change over time to estimate how long ago populations diverged. Two specific pieces of DNA are especially useful here. Mitochondrial DNA, also known as mDNA, passed only through mothers, and the Y chromosome, passed only through the fathers. So one of each. Because each follows a single unbroken line, researchers can trace them backward. This is done with clarity. Unlike when you mix from both parents, it just doesn't offer the same outcome. So, tracing those two lines back far enough produces two of the most famous and most badly misunderstood phrases in popular science: Mitochondrial Eve and, less famous, Y chromosome Adam. The popular version, of course, goes something like this. Mitochondrial Eve was the first woman, possibly the only woman alive at the time. And she and Y chromosome Adam were in some sense a founding couple. Of course, none of that is quite right. Mitochondrial Eve was not the only woman alive in her era. She lived among a full population of other women. What makes her identifiable at all is that she is the most recent woman from whom every mitochondrial lineage alive today ultimately traces back. Not because her own single line survived while every other woman's died out entirely, but because multiple branches descending from her did survive and diversify into everyone alive now. Every other woman in her generation may also have living descendants today, through their sons or through lines that just simply don't show up in this particular kind of maternal-only tracing. Mitochondrial Eve isn't a survivor where everyone else failed. She's the statistical point where this one specific method's branches converge. As for whether she and Y chromosome Adam ever met, well, the honest answer is we don't know, and we can't, even with that precision, know what that question implies. Estimates for when each of them lived have shifted considerably as methods have improved. In some published ranges do overlap, however, there is no certainty that they ever met. They probably were not a founding couple in any meaningful sense. Even if their lifetimes did overlap, they would have been two individuals among a much larger population, not humanity's Adam and Eve. But calling their meeting impossible overstates what the current evidence actually rules out. I guess part of the confusion traces straight back to the names themselves. Call something Eve and everyone hears the first woman, because that's the story everyone already knows. The underlying science is sound, though. The names, in hindsight, invited a misunderstanding that ultimately would follow. Both Eve and Adam, or Adam and Eve, are best understood the way this whole series keeps understanding things. A single statistical thread traced backwards out of a much larger, much bushier population, most of whose branches simply don't show up in this one particular kind of tracing. So one more thing, because it plants a seed for where this video goes next. Both of these traceable lines do lead back to African populations. We're going to develop that fact properly later. Just hold on to it for now. This all does more than just correct old myths. It also lets us go looking for people the fossil record has never shown us at all. Populations who's never left bones, that we've found at least, but who may have left a trace, buried in the DNA of people alive today. Go back for a moment with me to the very end of the previous video. Homo naledi, a hominin with a brain a third the size of yours, dated far more recently than its anatomy would predict. Last video, we said that genetic research had started turning up hints of other populations entirely. Ones that left no skeleton that was ever found, only a trace that was buried in DNA. We said the tools to chase that thread would belong to a later chapter. This is that chapter. So here's the question. Pointing the genetic toolkit not at tracing a single line, but at looking for evidence of mixing. What happens if two genuinely distinct, deeply diverged populations came together at some point in Africa's deep past? The honest answer is that something like this probably happened more than once in at least some African populations. But the honest answer also has to include a real complication. Researchers aren't fully agreed on what is producing that signal. And here is the complication at hand. When researchers examine the genomes of certain living African populations, including some Central African hunter-gatherer groups, they find stretches of DNA that do not fit the expected pattern of straightforward descent. There are two explanations for this right now. One is a genuine admixture, interbreeding with a population that had been genetically separate for a very long time, diverging on its own path before rejoining the wider human gene pool, a true ghost lineage, with no known fossil to even match it. The other is something less dramatic but equally real in this conversation. Persistent population structure. Ancient African Homo sapien groups may have remained partially separated from each other for very long stretches, with only intermittent contact between them, producing genetic patterns that can look, on the surface, like admixture with an outside population, without actually requiring one. So both of these explanations are currently being taken seriously by researchers that are working on this question. And both may be contributing to what we are seeing. We're not going to pretend this is settled in a favor of the more dramatic option just because mysterious unknown human relative makes a better story than these populations were simply separated from each other for a very long time. The genetic signal is real, but what is producing it in any given case is just still being worked out, honestly. Here's something that we actually can say, though. In the genomes of some sampled African populations, researchers have detected ancestry patterns that may reflect contact with deeply diverged groups whose fossils have never actually been identified. That's a different, more genuine claim than just saying it definitely happened to everyone with African ancestry. And it's the one that evidence is actually supporting right now. Let's draw one more clear line while we're at it, because there's a much more famous version of the story we're deliberately not telling here. Modern humans, after leaving Africa, interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, well documented in the genomes of people with ancestry outside of Africa. That story will get its own treatment somewhere else. The signals being discussed here concern the population history within Africa, given the title, and are distinct from the better documented Neanderthal and Denisovan admixture that followed the human dispersals into Eurasia. This is the exact kind of finding that should make you recalibrate how complete this story actually feels. There is real evidence sitting in living genomes right now of complexity that we don't have the full explanation for. Whether that complexity comes from populations that we've never simply found bones for, or from ancient African groups staying more separated from each other for longer than a simple family tree would suggest. Okay, next, we finally turn outward. Not to follow anyone out of Africa yet, but to ask what would push a population to leave the only home their species had ever known, and why that push would often end in failure. Say out of Africa to almost anyone, and you'll probably just get the same mental image. A single purposeful migration. Humanity striding confidently outward. It's tidy. It's also, as far as the evidence goes, close to backwards. People left Africa several times, tens of thousands of years apart, long before the migration that eventually populated the rest of the world. And most of those earlier attempts don't show up as the principal ancestors of the populations who would come after. Why would a door open at all? Climate doing quiet work again is the answer. The Sinai and Arabian peninsulas are, today, some of the most punishing deserts on Earth. They haven't always been, though. Through Pleistocene climate cycles, windows would open, sometimes lasting thousands of years. When shifting rainfall turned these barriers into green corridors, survival for both animals and the people following them, that would be the key to all of this. And when the climate cycled back, the door would close again. Population growth pressing against what a landscape could support also mattered. A more mundane pressure, but a real one, pushing people outward whenever a corridor would open. So the door opened, and people went through it. And more than once, that trail just goes cold. At School and Kafsa in modern Israel, human remains date to somewhere between roughly 90,000 and 120,000 years ago. Tens of thousands of years before the migration that eventually would succeed. These were the early members of our species, anatomically modern or very close to it. They were living outside Africa this early, and these populations are not currently understood to represent the principal ancestral line of the non-African populations that came later. That's a more careful claim than saying they left no descendants at all. The honest position is that we can't currently trace a clear continuing line from them to today's non-African populations. Not that we've proven none exist. Push back further to Mislia, and a pattern holds even earlier. A jawbone pushing solid evidence of a modern human that is present outside of Africa roughly 180,000 years ago. Again, though, with no clear onward story that we can currently trace. And at Epidema, which is in Greece, some researchers argue for a modern human presence that is as far back as 210,000 years ago. It's currently flagged as contested, though, in this case, since both the dating and the identification of these remains are currently actively disputed. So here's the honest thread connecting both of these sites. Whatever these populations did achieve, we cannot currently trace a continuous line from them to the people who eventually populated the rest of the world. This wasn't Africa producing people who weren't ready yet. Every capability required to leave was already there, tens of thousands of years even earlier. So why did the migration that eventually succeed actually do it? Well, recent research adds a genuine complication to the simple "it was a luck" story. A major recent 2025 analysis found evidence of a substantial expansion in the range of habitats occupied by Homo sapiens within Africa. It began around 70,000 years ago, right before the dispersal actually stuck. The researchers do argue that greater ecological flexibility, which is an ability to thrive in a wider range of environments, may actually help explain why this particular expansion succeeded where those earlier ones just did not. That doesn't prove some later cognitive leap, though. We're not walking back to, the Section 1's mosaic model, but it does suggest something more than just pure chance and an open climate door that may have been at work. Broader ecological experience, larger or better connected social networks, more resilient demographics, or, of course, some combination the earlier populations just did not have. So, as you quite imagine, the door opened more than once. People walked through it more than once. And more than once, we lose that thread behind them. Until, this time, we don't. After a section spent walking through uncertain endings, we arrive at the dispersal we can actually trace with real confidence. So sometimes roughly between 60 and 70 thousands of years ago, Expansion out of Africa succeeded in a way that these earlier attempts did not. Most ancestry in populations with long established roots outside of Africa derives from a subset of the diversity present within Africa at that time, or more precisely, from one major expansion or a closely connected series of expansions, rather than necessarily a single band crossing a single boundary on a single occasion. Genomic studies strongly support a major out-of-Africa bottleneck and lower diversity in non-African populations, while also showing that population history was way more complicated than just one isolated crossing. But it is worth being precise about what bottleneck actually means here. What does bottleneck actually mean? Because the word can sound more dramatic than the reality. A bottleneck does not mean humanity shrank down to a handful of people that were huddled somewhere. It means the population moving outward carried with it only a limited sample of genetic variation present among the much larger populations still living across the continent being Africa. The way a small scoop is taken from a large, varied jar carries some of what is in the jar, but not all of it. Not in the same proportions, if that metaphor makes sense. As that smaller population did expand outward and grew over tens of thousands of years, its descendants carried that narrower sample forward, generation after generation, which is a large part of why non-African populations today show measurably less genetic diversity than those African populations do. We won't pretend this was inevitable or that these people were meaningfully different from the ones that came before and didn't establish a lasting line. What the last section suggested is a broader ecological flexibility, better connected social networks, and a simple timing that probably mattered more than any single dramatic advantage they had. The route itself, though, is genuinely disputed. One candidate, a northern route through the Sinai into the Levant, the same corridor that hosted the earlier populations at Skul and Kafsa. The other, a southern route across the Red Sea at Bab el-Mandeb, following the Indian Ocean coastline. Researchers do argue for both, and for combinations of both at different times. So we're not going to, resolve that here because it's just currently not resolved. Here's what matters, though, more than that route. The population, or populations, involved in this expansion were not representative of the full range of human genetic diversity across Africa at that time. That narrower sample is going to matter enormously by the end of this video. Now, the discipline this section does need to hold, we're going to stop here. We could follow these populations onward into Arabia and from across most of the recent inhabited world, relatively speaking. That story is real and it's remarkable. It belongs to future chapters, maybe, of this series. Our job here is, though, to walk these travelers to the water's edge and stop, deliberately, rather than following them into a story that isn't ours to tell right now. So what I'm meaning here is we are not going past the African continent. What we are going to follow is what happened next inside the continent. Because the door these populations walked through never closed for good, and what came back through is going to complicate the tidy picture of a single one-way departure. So, if we stop the story where the last section left it, you'd probably be holding a specific picture. A population walks out of Africa, and from that point forward, the continent's role in this particular story is essentially finished. This section right now exists to correct that before it would settle in. The door between Africa and the rest of the world did not close behind that departing population. People moved back in more than once over tens of thousands of years, and what they carry genetically complicates any clean one-directional story this may hold. Researchers have found clear genetic evidence of populations moving from Southwest Asia back into North Africa and the Horn of Africa at multiple points across the tens of thousands of years following the original expansion, carrying ancestry that had by then developed outside the continent and mixing it into the populations already living in those regions. And here's where the story gets genuinely elegant. By the time some of these populations moved back into Africa, their own ancestors out in Southwest Asia had already interbred with Neanderthals. An encounter this section will not develop since it belongs to a different part of the series, but it matters here directly. Some of that Neanderthal-derived ancestry rode back into Africa with these returning populations. There are people living in Africa today who carry a small, genuinely traceable amount of Neanderthal ancestry. Not through direct contact, since no confirmed Neanderthal population is known to have lived in Africa, but through the back door, carried home by people whose own journey looped around. This actually connects to that last section's fraction. The population that made the successful exit carried only a narrower sample of Africa's diversity outward. What this section does add is that Africa's own story did not pause or wait after that. It kept absorbing new genetic material. It kept changing, shaped by contact with populations returning from the outside. An active, ongoing process, not a static baseline still untouched while the real action happened elsewhere. So I want to be honest about scale here too. This back migration is real and is well documented, but it doesn't mean that most of Africa's population was fundamentally reshaped by it, or that this returning ancestry rivals the much older, much deeper diversity built up across the continent over hundreds of thousands of years before any of this exit and return traffic began. A real meaningful layer added to the specific regions at specific times, not a wholesale rewriting. So this is what I need you to hold on to. This was never an arrow, but leaving once and never returning. It was a repeated exchange, running in both directions across Africa's northern and eastern borders, over tens of thousands of years after that first successful expansion. So next, we bring this entire two-part origin story to its actual point. Not a triumphant close, but an honest one about what actually stayed and what staying meant. Alright, so here's the fact. Everything in these last two videos, and yes, talking about the video before this video that you're watching right now, so go check that one out if you haven't already. But here's the fact, everything these last two videos have been building toward, and what we want to state carefully, because it's easy to get this one wrong in a way that sounds good and isn't quite true. African populations collectively hold more human genetic diversity than populations on any other continent, including many variants and deeply structured lineages found nowhere else on Earth. Much of the common variation found outside of Africa today derives from a subset carried through a out-of-Africa bottleneck described over the last two sections. So here's what that does not mean, and it matters that we say it so directly. It does not mean any living African population is an unchanged branch preserved from a deep prehistory. No population anywhere on Earth is that. Every population alive today has migrated, mixed, divided, adapted, and continuously for an entire span of time this entire series has covered. Deep branching, when researchers use that phrase, describes a population's statistical relationship with a genetic model. Not just a group being older, closer to some of the original humanity, or somehow standing still while everyone else has moved on. The San peoples of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Mbuti and Baka of the Central African rainforest. Genetic research does show these populations carrying lineages that diverge early from the branching patterns researchers can reconstruct. That's genuinely significant in this phrase, and worth understanding precisely rather than just romantically. It means their specific genetic history split off from other studied population histories earlier than many others did. It does not mean their history since then has been simpler, slower, or more preserved. Every one of these is a contemporary people with its own complex, continuing history of movement, contact, and change across tens of thousands of years. It's not a window into a frozen past. And there's a real pointed connection worth making with the Mbuti and Baka specifically, tying back to the very first video in this entire African series. We told you then that the Congo rainforest is close to a blank spot on that fossil map. Not because nothing happened there, but because the region's soil and climate make bone almost impossible to preserve. So we called that a silence. It wasn't entirely one. Part of the history that bone could not preserve survives another medium, in the genomes of people living right now. Though those patterns record movement, mixture, and change, as well as continuity. Not a single unbroken thread just waiting to be read. So here's the more careful version of what this two-part story has shown so far. This population that made the successful expansion out of Africa carried a genuine but narrower sample of the continent's diversity outward. The populations that remained did not preserve some ancient world unchanged, sealed off while the history happened elsewhere. They did keep moving, and kept mixing, separating, and reconnecting, generating histories every bit as dynamic and eventful as anything unfolding behind or beyond the continent's borders. Africa's extraordinary depth of genetic diversity exists not because its people stood still, but because many deeply structured, repeatedly reconnecting populations kept actively living, changing, and building lives across the continent for hundreds of thousands of years, the entire time anyone was leaving, and much long after. So the word that this series so far has used throughout, cradle, can accidentally suggest infancy, a place you're born and eventually outgrow. That's just not what the evidence supports. Africa is not a place humanity started out with and moved past. It's the root system the entire tree is still connected to. And that root system was never dormant. It was working the entire time. The human mind did not awaken once in one place at one moment. Its archaeological traces emerged unevenly, engraved in pigment at Blombos, engineered into composite tools, preserved clearly at some sites and lost completely at others. Genetics reveals a related but different story. Populations separating, reconnecting, moving outward, and later returning, while human lives and cultures continued changing across the continent. So, some populations left Africa. Many remained. Those who departed carried only a subset of the continent's diversity with them. Those who stayed did not preserve the past. They kept making the future the same as everyone else the entire time. So what comes next? It's a changing climate, a green Sahara, and an entirely new way of living in it. It begins on that same continent, not because Africa is where humanity used to be, but it's because Africa's human story never stopped being written.